In the summer of 1847, just outside Savannah, Georgia, a fire consumed a house that was never meant to stand. The neighbors spoke of lightning, of accident, of divine punishment, but what the flames truly devoured was far darker. Beneath its white columns and manicured gardens, Merrifield Plantation hid a secret so vile that the city itself conspired to forget it. For more than 60 years, its story lay buried until 1911, when a carpenter restoring a courthouse wall uncovered a leather-bound ledger. Inside were names, births, and a final confession signed in a trembling hand. Jonah Wainwright, son of the house called Merrifield. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and unmistakably human, yet what it revealed was inhuman. The ledger spoke of a family built on silence, a father who believed himself a god, and a bloodline cursed by its own creation. Savannah called it a tragedy. History called it myth. But the truth, hidden beneath the ashes, was neither. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on, because stories like this, stories the South tried to erase, deserve to be heard. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see just how far Savannah's secret has traveled. Now, let's go back to the spring of 1847. The streets of Savannah were alive with commerce and charm, carriages rolling over cobblestone, the scent of sugar and sweat hanging in the air. And just beyond the city limits, in a grand estate called Merrifield, a man named Elias Wainwright was building an empire not of wealth or cotton, but of blood. This is where the story begins. The hammer struck the wall with a dull thud, sending a cloud of plaster dust into the air. Beneath the cracked paint and termite-bitten boards of the old Savannah estate, something waited. The workers thought it was just another hidden cavity, maybe a nest of rats or forgotten silverware, but when one of them reached inside and pulled out a narrow leather-bound book, the air in the room seemed to change. It was soft and brittle, its cover warped by humidity, the spine nearly gone. When they opened it, the scent of smoke and mildew rose like a ghost of another century. Inside were names written in iron gall ink, faded to a dull brown. Most were half-legible, but one column caught their eyes immediately. It read, "Issue. By daughter." The men laughed at first, uneasy and confused, until one realized what issue meant in that time. In that place. It meant offspring. The blood drained from his face. They closed the book and handed it to the foreman, who passed it on to the property owner, a banker restoring the mansion to its original charm. Within days, the ledger was in the hands of the local historical society. They met in a sunlit office above Bay Street, surrounded by portraits of men who had built Savannah's wealth on human bondage. The curator, an elderly gentleman with spectacles perched low on his nose, studied the column in silence. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from recognition. The handwriting was unmistakable. It matched the signature of Elias Wainwright, master of Merrifield Plantation, one of the wealthiest men in Georgia before the war. Wainwright's name was legend in Savannah, spoken with reverence, his descendants still seated among the city's elite. Yet here, in this ledger, his legacy appeared as something else entirely, a confession disguised as bookkeeping. Beneath the neat columns of cotton yields and expenses were names of enslaved women, followed by the chilling annotation, "Issue, by daughter." Each entry carried the same pattern, the same cold precision. No emotion, no hesitation, just record-keeping, as if accounting for livestock. The curator snapped the book shut. He knew immediately this ledger could not be displayed, not in a city still polishing its image of genteel history. He called a brief meeting with the board. They agreed the contents were inconclusive, likely the product of clerical confusion or misinterpretation of familial terminology. Within an hour, the ledger was locked in a drawer, its existence quietly omitted from public record. But secrets do not rest easy in Savannah. One of the workers who found it couldn't shake the feeling that the book was alive in some way. He dreamed of it. Heard whispers at night, children's laughter, the rustle of skirts, a low hum like a hymn. 2 weeks later, he vanished. His tools were found by the hearth where the ledger had been discovered. The townspeople blamed drink, but those who knew the house's history whispered something else. They said Merrowfield had always demanded its secrets back. As years passed, rumors spread through the preservation circles. Some said the ledger was destroyed in a fire. Others claimed it still existed, hidden in a vault beneath the courthouse with other documents too shameful to surface. What few people knew was that a single page had been torn from it before the cover was sealed again. On that page, in faint ink barely visible beneath the stains of time, were 3 words written in a different hand, as though added long after the original entries. The handwriting was delicate, almost childlike. It read, "He was my father." That was when Savannah's silence began to tremble. The year was 1847, and Savannah pulsed like a living creature, its cobblestone streets slick with humidity and sin. Carriages rolled past the market square, their wheels splashing through puddles that reflected iron balconies and the heavy sway of Spanish moss. The air smelled of salt, sugar, and sweat. Every week, beneath the shadow of the courthouse, the square transformed into something grotesque yet ordinary, a theater where men traded flesh as easily as they traded cotton. The cries of infants mixed with the bark of auctioneers. Beneath the creak of gallows-like platforms, humanity was weighed, priced, and stripped of its name. Elias Wainwright stood near the front of the crowd, a figure of wealth and authority dressed in ivory linen, his cane tipped with gold, his smile the kind that could charm a senator or silence a slave. To most of Savannah, he was the perfect gentleman educated in Charleston, mannerly, generous to the church. He spoke with the slow confidence of a man who owned both the land and the people upon it. Yet behind that civility lurked something else, a hunger that no amount of property or prestige could satisfy. His reputation reached far beyond the parish lines, whispered about at dinner tables and in the quarters alike. Some called him blessed. Others called him cursed. That morning the auction was in full swing. Men leaned from balconies, shouting bids over the murmurs of the crowd. A girl no older than 13 stood trembling on the platform, her wrists bound, her eyes glazed with fear. A gavel slammed. Sold. The crowd shifted, and Wainwright's gaze lingered not on the girl but on her mother, who stood beside her, silent and shaking. He studied them the way another man might study livestock, not with cruelty, but with a chilling kind of fascination. He did not need more servants. He had dozens. What interested him was blood lineage, breeding, the control of generations. He turned to his overseer, a broad man named Silas Crane, and spoke softly. "Have the woman brought to Merrowfield by nightfall." Crane hesitated. "The mother, sir?" Wainwright's eyes narrowed, and the question died in Crane's throat. When the auction ended, the square emptied as quickly as it had filled. Laughter returned, and the market resumed its rhythm as if nothing unnatural had occurred. But in the shadows beneath the grand oaks, a rumor began to stir of a master who bought not for profit but for creation, who believed his own blood divine enough to mix with any. Those who served him knew better than to speak his name after sunset. They called him the Father of Flesh. And Savannah, wrapped in its finery and faith, pretended not to hear. Merrowfield sat beyond the edge of Savannah, where the live oaks thickened and the land began to taste of salt and decay. From the road it appeared magnificent, a grand house with columns that shone like ivory in the sunday. Visitors often paused at its gates, admiring its symmetry, its grace, the illusion of purity that radiated from its facade. But those who stepped beyond the front doors learned quickly that beauty in Merrowfield was a kind of deception, a mask stretched tight over rot. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed with lavender and old wood, but beneath that sweetness lingered something metallic, something that made even servants cross themselves before entering certain rooms. Charlotte and Eveline Wainwright drifted through these halls like ghosts tethered to ritual. Charlotte, the elder, carried herself with the precision of a woman twice her age, every gesture measured, every word rehearsed. She was her father's pride, trained to smile at guests, to host with grace, to never question. Eveline, only 16, was different. Her laughter came too easily. Her gaze lingered too long on the people her father called property, and her questions, when she dared to ask them, were answered with silence or the sharp crack of a cane against the table. The house itself seemed to breathe around them. Portraits of ancestors stared from the walls, their faces painted in oil and arrogance, their eyes following anyone who passed. The marble floors gleamed, but the servants whispered that beneath one of them lay a hidden cellar, a place where the master conducted his most private business. No one spoke of what that business was, but they heard things at night. Muffled cries, the scrape of chains. Sometimes a lullaby sung so softly that even the crickets stopped to listen. Each morning, Elias Wainwright descended from his study, immaculate in his coat and waistcoat, smelling of brandy and tobacco. He kissed his daughters on the forehead, as though affection were part of the ritual too. He spoke of God, of bloodlines, of destiny. He told them their duty was to protect the family name, to ensure the purity of its legacy. Charlotte listened, nodded, and folded her hands in her lap. The servants moved silently around them, eyes lowered, carrying trays of food they would never taste. They knew more than anyone what lay beneath the veneer of civility. They knew about the births that occurred at midnight and the children who vanished by dawn. They knew the screams that traveled up through the floorboards and the laughter that followed. At night, when the lamps were extinguished and the house settled into its heavy silence, Eveline would lie awake, staring at the ceiling above her bed, tracing the cracks in the plaster like a map. She could feel the house breathing beneath her, could sense the weight of the secrets buried in its foundation. Somewhere below, her father was awake too, moving through the corridors with deliberate steps, carrying the same lantern he always carried when the rest of the world slept. And though she never saw what he did in those hours, she knew one thing with a certainty that made her blood run cold. Whatever her father built at Marrowfield, it was not a home, it was an altar. The rules of Marrowfield were not written on paper, but everyone knew them. They were learned in whispers, in glances, in the quiet terror that passed from one servant to the next. No eye contact, no questions, no sound after sundown. Each rule was simple, but breaking one could end a life. The walls of the Wainwright estate had witnessed too much to forgive curiosity. As dusk fell, the house changed. The laughter that sometimes fluttered faintly through its halls during the day would vanish, replaced by a silence so complete it felt alive. Servants moved like shadows, their bare feet gliding over marble floors, extinguishing candles, closing curtains, locking doors. When the last flame was put out, they retreated to the quarters beyond the fields, praying not to hear what would come after. For it was never the screams that haunted them most, but the moments of absolute quiet that followed. Inside the dining room, Elias Wainwright sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The silverware gleamed beneath the soft light of a single chandelier. Charlotte and Eveline sat opposite one another, pale and still, their eyes lowered to their plates. Supper was not conversation but ceremony. Every bite, every sip, every pause was governed by unspoken command. Wainwright believed order was the highest form of morality, and he enforced it with a priest's devotion. He spoke rarely during meals, only to remind his daughters that silence was a virtue and obedience a blessing. Charlotte nodded, her movements graceful, rehearsed. Eveline's fork often froze halfway to her lips, her eyes darting toward her father, searching for the smallest crack in his calm. There never was one. When the clock struck 9, Wainwright would stand, fold his napkin, and say the same words he had said every night since they could remember. The house rests now. No one disturbs its sleep. The servants knew what came next. They knew to clear the table without looking at the cellar door in the east wing, the one no one was permitted to open. Sometimes, late at night, Eveline would hear it. The faint scrape of metal on stone, a low voice murmuring words she could not make out, then the sound of chains. Charlotte pretended not to hear, but her hands trembled when she poured tea in the morning. It was said the cellar was older than the house itself, built before the first brick of Marrowfield ever touched the earth. The slaves who had laid the foundation whispered that it was a place meant to keep something in, not out. But by the time anyone thought to question it, the cellar had already become part of the family's rhythm, its dark pulse beating beneath their feet. And so, the rules remained. No eye contact. No questions. No sound after sundown. Because in Marrowfield, silence was safety, and breaking it meant becoming part of whatever lay beneath the east wing forever. Silas Crane had been an overseer at Marrowfield for almost 15 years. To outsiders, he was a man of discipline and precision, the kind who could make an entire field of workers fall silent with a single glance. Every night, he sat at a heavy oak desk in his quarters, lit by a single candle, recording the births, deaths, and transactions of the plantation. He wrote, with the slow, deliberate care of someone who understood that ink had power. The ledger he kept was his commandment book, his map of human worth. But lately, the names had started to blur. The columns of mother and father no longer made sense, lines crossed where they should not. The bloodlines tangled until there was no longer a line at all, just a circle that began and ended with the same man. Crane was not an educated man, but he was observant. He had seen things in the Wainwright house that should have stayed unspoken. He had seen the way Elias Wainwright looked at his daughters, not with affection, but with possession. He had seen the children born on the plantation who carried skin too light, eyes too familiar, faces that mirrored the family portraits hanging in the main hall. Each time a child was born, he recorded its name, its mother, and by order of the master the name of the father. But more often than not, that space was left blank. One humid evening, when the air hung heavy with the smell of sugarcane and sweat, Crane sat staring at the newest page of his ledger. The candle flickered, throwing long shadows across the room. He had been told to record another birth, a girl born to a young fieldworker barely 16. The child's eyes were gray, the same gray as Elias Wainwright's. The mother refused to speak when questioned. Crane did not need her to. He already knew. He dipped his quill in ink and hesitated. His hand trembled. The master's orders were clear. All records were to be precise, all lines obedient. But something inside him cracked. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps fear. He pressed the quill to paper and wrote the father's name in a slow, heavy stroke. Elias Wainwright. The ink bled into the fibers, spreading like a wound. For a long time, Crane stared at what he had done. It felt like blasphemy, but also truth. The walls of his quarters seemed to close in, the creak of the boards above him sounding like footsteps. He could almost hear Wainwright's voice in the back of his mind, calm and dangerous. By morning, the ink had dried, but the fear had not. Crane closed the ledger and locked it in the drawer beneath his bed. He told himself it would never be found, that he had buried his sin in silence. Yet deep down, he knew better. Nothing stayed buried at Marrowfield, not secrets, not blood, and certainly not the truth written in his own hand. The church bells of Savannah rang each Sunday morning, echoing through the cypress groves and drifting across the Wainwright plantation like a call to salvation. Inside the grand white chapel, where the pews gleamed and the air smelled of magnolia and incense, Charlotte Wainwright sat beside her father with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was the very image of grace, a porcelain calm that never cracked, no matter how many eyes turned toward her. The townsfolk whispered about her beauty, her devotion, her perfect composure. None of them saw the quiet tremor in her breath when her father placed his hand over hers, holding it a second too long. The people of Savannah loved a spectacle of piety, and Elias Wainwright gave them one. He sang hymns in a voice that carried authority, bowed his head in reverence, and left generous donations in the collection box. Behind him, Charlotte's lips moved in perfect unison with the choir, her voice soft and pure. But beneath her, Sunday calm was a silence that had grown so deep it no longer belonged to her. It was her armor, her prison, and her punishment all at once. In the afternoons, when the sermons ended and the carriages returned to Marrowfield, Charlotte would retreat to the veranda, her white dress glowing under the sunlight. She watched the fields sway in the wind, pretending not to see the faces of the children who looked like her. They worked among the others, their hair lighter, their features delicate, their eyes too familiar. Every time one of them looked up, she turned away. Her father called them servants. She called them nothing at all. At night, when the house fell quiet, Charlotte would sit at her vanity, brushing her hair until her scalp burned. The mirror reflected a woman who had learned to separate her soul from her body. She had stopped counting the years since the first child. She had stopped asking why God remained silent. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the reflection behind her, a flicker of a shadow, a shape standing just beyond the candlelight, but when she turned, there was nothing. Only the house breathing, heavy and watchful. Eveline, her younger sister, often found her sitting awake long after midnight. She would ask softly if Charlotte was ill, if something was wrong. Charlotte would smile, the same practiced smile she wore at church, and say she was fine. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the truth. They were empty, like a window in a house long abandoned. The servants spoke of her in hushed tones, saying she was blessed to have inherited her mother's beauty and her father's strength. But those who had seen her alone, staring out over the fields as the sun sank low, knew that strength had turned to stone inside her. Charlotte Wainwright had mastered silence not because she wished to, but because she had learned that in Marrowfield, silence was the only way to survive. Beneath Marrowfield, below the marble floors and gilded chandeliers, lay the cellar that few dared speak of. It was a world apart from the grand plantation house above, where laughter and music occasionally echoed through open windows. Down here, the air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of mold, blood, and candle wax. The walls dripped with moisture, the flicker of lantern light revealing stains that would never wash away. It was here that the births took place secret, unholy, and unrecorded by any church. When the pains began, the women were brought quietly, their cries muffled beneath the sound of distant thunder or the hum of cicadas. Sometimes they were carried, sometimes they walked, led by trembling hands that belonged to other women who had survived the same fate. There was no midwife from town, only an elderly woman named Ada who once delivered foals before she was forced into this darker duty. Her hands shook as she worked, not from weakness, but from memory. She had delivered too many children into a world that did not want them. No prayers were said in that cellar. The women knew better than to ask for mercy from a God who seemed to have forgotten them. When a child was born, Ada wiped it clean, wrapped it in coarse cloth, and waited. Sometimes the babies cried, small, fragile sounds that echoed through the stone chamber like a plea. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, by dawn, they were gone. Elias Wainwright never came down during the births, but his presence was always felt. His orders were clear. The children were to be moved before daylight. Some were sent to the fields as they grew, their lineage hidden behind new names and false ledgers. Others disappeared entirely, sold quietly to distant plantations, their existence erased before it could take root. The servants who helped were warned that speaking of what they had seen would mean ruin or death. Charlotte knew. Eveline suspected. The house above them creaked with secrets, each groan of its beams a reminder of what lay below. On certain nights, when the wind rattled the shutters, Eveline could swear she heard it, the faint sound of a baby crying through the floorboards, the sobbing cut short by silence. She once asked her sister if she heard it too. Charlotte simply said no and walked away, her eyes fixed on the stairs leading downward. As years passed, the cellar became something of a legend among the workers. Some said the walls themselves could feel, that the spirits of the mothers lingered there, rocking invisible cradles, singing lullabies to children who never had names. Others swore that if you pressed your ear to the floor above the east wing, you could still hear them voices from beneath the earth, whispering the truth that Marrowfield tried to bury. The family called it the birthing room. The servants called it what it truly was. The place where innocence was born only to be buried before it ever saw the Sunday. The summer of 1847 settled over Marrowfield like a fever. The air was so thick it seemed to hum, and the house, heavy with secrets, began to feel smaller by the day. Eveline Wainwright had always been curious, too much so for her father's liking. Where Charlotte moved through life with quiet acceptance, Eveline questioned everything: the prayers at dinner, the closed doors, the cellar that no one spoke of. She noticed things her sister had long taught herself to ignore. The stains on the steps to the east wing, the strange hours when her father would vanish with his lantern, returning only when the sky began to pale. That curiosity festered until it became obsession. She began counting his footsteps at night, memorizing the rhythm of his movements. Every evening after supper, Elias would retreat to his study, pour himself brandy, and wait until the household was asleep before descending the back staircase. One night, when the heat refused to let her rest, Eveline rose from her bed and followed. Barefoot and trembling, she crept down the corridor, her white nightdress brushing the floor, her heartbeat matching the tick of the clock. She watched from the shadows as her father unlocked the cellar door. The key glinted in the lamplight. He descended the stairs, and for a moment, Eveline hesitated, knowing that whatever lay below would change her forever. But the sound of something like a whimper, pulled her forward. She followed, careful to stay in darkness, her breath shallow as she stepped into the chill of the underground passage. The lantern light flickered ahead of her, revealing shapes that made no sense. Chains hung from the walls, rusted and worn. A table stood at the center of the room, covered in sheets darkened with old stains. The smell hit her neck, sweet and rotting, like flowers left too long in water. Then she saw them. Women, their faces pale and hollow, seated against the walls. Some were pregnant, others broken by pain and silence. A child's cry pierced the air, weak and fading. Eveline froze, her eyes wide as her father lifted the infant, inspected it as though it were no more than property, and handed it to one of the overseers. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows, trembling as tears blurred her vision. Her father's voice, calm and composed, drifted through the room. He spoke of lineage, of purity, of perfection. The overseer nodded, taking the child through a side door. When Eveline finally stumbled back upstairs, her stomach lurched, and she collapsed in the hallway, shaking violently. The image would not leave her: the women, the table, the child's fading cry. Something inside her cracked open. But what emerged was not fear. It was defiance. From that night on, she no longer prayed at dinner. She no longer bowed her head when her father spoke. There was a fire behind her eyes, a dangerous kind of knowing that frightened even Charlotte. Eveline had seen what no one was meant to see, and she understood now that silence was complicity. In a house built on sin and sorrow, her rebellion had begun, and for the first time, Marrowfield trembled. The boy was born on a stormy night, when lightning clawed across the sky and the trees around Marrowfield bent as if bowing to some invisible power. The women in the quarters said the heavens themselves protested his arrival. His name was Jonah. He had eyes too pale for the child of an enslaved woman, and skin that carried neither the deep tone of his mother nor the ivory of the man who owned her. He was a haunting in-between, a reflection of both worlds and belonging to neither. From the moment he drew breath, everyone knew whose face he carried. When Jonah began to walk, whispers followed him. The servants called him the Master's Mirror, a phrase spoken with both awe and fear. His jawline, his gaze, even the curl of his hair were echoes of Elias Wainwright. It was as if the plantation itself had conjured a smaller, softer version of its master, a living confession the man could not erase. The older workers crossed themselves when he passed, fearing he carried a curse. The younger ones stared, curious but careful, knowing that children like Jonah rarely grew old on plantations like this. Elias pretended not to notice at first, dismissing the gossip as foolish talk, but he could not ignore the boy's presence forever. Every time Jonah crossed the yard or fetched water from the well, Elias's eyes followed him, sharp and uncertain. He saw himself in that child, the same gray eyes, the same defiant chin, and for a man obsessed with power, nothing was more dangerous than a reminder that he was capable of weakness. Jonah's mother, Ruth, tried to keep him hidden. She told him not to speak too loudly, not to look anyone in the eye, not to smile when Elias was near. But the boy was curious, bright, too much like the man who had created him. He would sit by the edge of the fields at dusk, carving shapes into the dirt with a stick, whispering questions only the wind could answer. One evening, Elias approached him. The overseers stood back, uneasy. The master knelt beside the boy, studying him in silence. Then, in a tone that made every man in earshot stiffen, he said, "You will call me sir, and nothing more." Jonah nodded, his face calm, but something fierce flickered in his eyes. It was the same defiance Eveline had once shown, the same dangerous spark that Wainwright's control could not smother. From that day forward, strange things began to happen. The master's horses grew restless when Jonah passed. Lamps in the east wing flickered out for no reason. The servants whispered that the boy's soul carried unfinished business, that he had been born not just of sin, but of retribution. Elias Wainwright began drinking more heavily, locking himself in his study at night, the sound of pacing footsteps echoing through the halls. Jonah grew in silence, watching, listening, his existence a living wound upon the house that made him, and though no one dared say it aloud, every soul at Marrowfield understood one truth. The child who bore the master's face would one day be the reason that face was forgotten. The preacher arrived at Marrowfield on a Sunday morning, his wagon creaking beneath the weight of his Bible and the silver cross that glinted at his chest. His name was Reverend Silas Moore, a traveling minister sent by the diocese to bring the Lord's light to the plantations scattered along the Savannah River. He came expecting hospitality, fine meals, and eager believers. What he found instead was a house that smiled too widely, a family that prayed too perfectly, and servants who moved as if afraid to breathe. Elias Wainwright greeted him with open arms, insisting the Lord's favor rested upon Marrowfield. The preacher accepted his invitation to stay for several days, eager to deliver his sermons to the master, his daughters, and the enslaved families who gathered at the edge of the courtyard. From the pulpit Elias had built for him, Reverend Moore spoke of grace, repentance, and divine justice. Yet even as his voice carried over the fields, his eyes wandered to the house, the immaculate shutters, the polished windows, the cellar door kept locked even in daylight. There was something unnatural in the air, something the preacher could not name but felt deep in his bones. He saw it in the faces of the servants, their bowed heads trembling during prayer. He saw it in Charlotte's frozen composure and in Eveline's haunted stare. But most of all, he saw it in the master himself. Wainwright's eyes did not shine with faith. They gleamed with control. That night, as supper was served beneath the soft glow of candles, Reverend Moore attempted conversation. He praised the household's devotion, their discipline, their attendance to Scripture. Elias smiled. "Faith," he said, "is not belief, Reverend. It is order. Without order, God's house falls." Charlotte's spoon clattered softly against her bowl, but she said nothing. Eveline stared at the table, her lips pressed tight. Later, when the house slept, the preacher was restless. He could not shake the feeling that God's house at Marrowfield had already fallen. He took a lantern and wandered through the halls, the air thick with silence. His steps led him toward the east wing, to the door everyone avoided. The lock was old, the key still inside. Curiosity, perhaps divine or perhaps fatal, pushed him to turn it. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled of earth and something far worse. He descended the stairs, his lantern trembling in his hand. The cellar stretched before him, vast and dark, its walls lined with chains, its floor stained with history. And there, half buried in the corner, he found what no sermon could forgive a child's doll, carved crudely from wood, its painted eyes gouged out, resting beside a small human bone. The lantern slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. He stumbled backward, whispering prayers, but no words could steady him. From the shadows, he thought he saw movement, the faint outline of a figure watching him. When he fled the cellar, heart pounding, he found Elias waiting at the top of the stairs. The master's expression was calm, his voice smooth. "You have seen too much, Reverend." The preacher tried to speak, but the words never came. By morning, his wagon was gone. The servants whispered that he left before dawn, but no one saw him on the road that day, or any day after. What the Reverend had discovered in the depths of Marrowfield did not reach the church, but it reached heaven. And heaven, for a moment, turned its face away. The days after the preacher's disappearance were heavy with silence. The servants spoke in whispers, Charlotte avoided the windows, and Eveline felt the walls of Marrowfield closing in tighter with each passing hour. Her father's temper had grown sharper, his sermons at dinner longer, his voice colder. Eveline knew that if she stayed silent much longer, she would drown in it. So one night, when the house slept and the cicadas sang outside her window, she lit a candle and began to write. The letters were meant for her mother's sister, Aunt Clarissa, who lived in Charleston, a woman Eveline barely remembered but whose name lingered in her mind like a memory of safety. She wrote with trembling hands, trying to describe the things that language could barely contain. She wrote about the cellar beneath the east wing, about the women forced into silence, about the child with her father's face. The ink smeared with tears as she tried to confess the truth her family had buried beneath marble and manners. Each sentence felt like a sin, but a necessary one. She ended the letter with a plea. Please, come for me before I am no longer myself. She sealed it quickly, pressed it to her chest, and prayed that the Lord might forgive her for telling the truth. At dawn, she handed it to one of the errand boys headed toward town, promising him a silver coin if he mailed it at the post house. She watched him ride off, her heart beating fast, believing for the first time that someone beyond Marrowfield might know what was happening there. But the letter never reached Charleston. Silas Crane intercepted it before it left the property. He had been watching Eveline closely ever since she started sneaking from her room at night. When he saw the boy carrying a sealed envelope bearing the Wainwright name, he stopped him and took it. That evening, as the house darkened, Crane sat alone in his quarters and read every word by candlelight. His stomach twisted as he reached the final lines. The letter spoke truths he had long tried to bury, truths he had written himself once, in the ledger locked beneath his bed. He stared at the paper for a long time, torn between duty and something dangerously close to guilt. Then, with a sigh that sounded like defeat, he fed the letter into the fire. The flames curled around it, devouring the ink, the words, the hope. He watched until it turned to ash. But Eveline did not stop writing. Night after night, she wrote new letters, hiding them behind loose floorboards, beneath her pillow, in the hollow of a tree near the gate, each one more desperate than the last. And each time, Silas found them. One by one, he burned them all, until the last. The final letter, the one written with a shaking hand and sealed with a single tear, did not burn. Crane hesitated as the firelight touched the paper. He folded it instead, tucking it deep into his coat pocket. Perhaps he did it out of mercy, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because some part of him knew the truth would need to survive, even if he did not. That letter would one day be found, long after Marrowfield had fallen. The ink faded, the words trembling, but the story intact, and it began with a name: Eveline Wainwright. The summer of 1848 brought with it a heat that seemed to suffocate even the wind. The air in Savannah turned thick as syrup, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Birds vanished from the sky, animals went silent, and the people of Marrowfield felt an unease they could not name. Then, one morning, the horizon darkened. The sky rolled inward, green and bruised, and the first distant growl of thunder shook the windows of the Wainwright estate. By nightfall, the storm had arrived. The hurricane struck with a force no one had seen in a generation. Rain came down like iron nails, hammering against the roof, seeping through the cracks of the grand plantation house. The wind screamed through the oaks, tearing limbs from trees and sending them crashing through the fields. Servants huddled in the quarters, praying over candlelight that flickered and died with every gust. Eveline clutched her sister's hand, both of them kneeling in the parlor, while their father stood by the window, unmoved. Elias Wainwright looked out upon the chaos like a man watching a baptism. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the flooded grounds. The river had swelled past its banks, devouring everything in its path. The family cemetery at the edge of the property gave way first. The graves cracked open as if the earth itself had decided it could no longer hold Marrowfield's secrets. Coffins floated free, and bones washed into the fields, tangled in roots and weeds. By dawn, the storm had stripped the land bare, and what it left behind could not be hidden again. When the rain ceased, the survivors emerged into a world reborn in ruin. The once proud mansion stood wounded, its columns stained, its foundation trembling. Silas Crane and a few of the workers began clearing debris, but what they found near the eastern slope froze them where they stood. The flood had unearthed more than the dead. Fragments of cloth, broken chains, the remains of children too small to have ever been buried with ceremony. And there, half buried in the mud, a piece of carved wood the same shape and size as a child's doll, its face scorched and eyeless. Eveline saw it first. Her father tried to pull her away, but she tore from his grasp, her voice breaking with horror. The servants began to murmur, then to shout. Some called it God's judgment. Others said the storm had brought the truth to light. Wainwright barked orders to silence them, but the whispers would not stop. That night, as the rain returned in soft, mournful sheets, Eveline lay awake, listening to the water drip through the ceiling. The house groaned around her, and for the first time, she thought she could hear the voices of those buried beneath the soil. They were not wailing. They were calling. The storm had not only broken the land, it had cracked open Merrowfield's carefully built illusion. And as the winds carried the scent of earth and bone through the halls, Eveline understood that no matter how deep her father buried his sins, the earth would always rise to speak them. By the time Jonah turned 12, the air at Merrowfield seemed to change whenever he entered a room. The boy had grown tall for his age, his eyes sharp, his voice steady, his every movement carrying a quiet defiance that reminded everyone of someone else. Elias Wainwright avoided looking at him directly now. He could no longer deny what everyone else already whispered behind closed doors. The boy was his reflection, carved from the same arrogance and bone. But what made the whispers turn to fear was the mark, the small crescent-shaped scar that curved just below Jonah's left shoulder. Elias had carried that same scar since his youth, the result of a hunting accident he often used as a story to amuse dinner guests. When the servants discovered that the boy shared it, the story changed. No longer was it an accident. It was a curse. They said God had grown tired of silence and had written Elias's sin into living flesh for all to see. Jonah did not know the full truth of his blood, but he felt its weight. The older he grew, the more the other children avoided him. Some feared him, others envied him, and a few, bolder than the rest, called him the master's ghost. He worked in the stables, where the horses calmed under his touch, and the overseers could not bring themselves to strike him. There was something about the way he looked at them, something that made even men like Silas Crane hesitate. One summer afternoon, while bathing in the river, Jonah noticed the scar himself for the first time. The water shimmered as he traced it with his fingers, the skin smooth but unnatural, almost glowing in the sunlight. That night, he asked his mother where it came from. Ruth froze, her hand stilling over the sewing in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, she whispered. The words haunted him. That same week Elias summoned the boy to the main house. He watched Jonah walk through the door with a poise too deliberate for a child. The master's gaze lingered on the scar visible beneath the boy's loose shirt. Neither spoke for a long time. When Elias finally did, his voice was low. "You will not show that mark again," he said. "It invites talk. And talk spreads." Jonah met his father's eyes and nodded, but his silence carried a challenge that Elias could feel in his bones. It was not the obedience of a servant, but the stillness before a storm. That night, the servants whispered again in the quarters. They said the boy's scar glowed under the moonlight. They said it was not flesh at all, but a sign God's own seal upon the sin of Merrowfield. Even Silas Crane, who scoffed at superstition, found himself crossing himself before sleep. The master's blood had tried to remain pure, untouched, divine. But the proof of his corruption walked his halls, breathing, thinking, and watching. And though Elias Wainwright forbade anyone to speak of it, the truth had already taken form. It wore his face, It carried his name in silence, and soon it would claim everything he built. The night Eveline ran from Merrowfield, the air was thick with the scent of rain and magnolia. The world seemed to hold its breath as she moved through the shadows, her hand gripping Jonah's tightly. The boy's bare feet made no sound on the wet earth, though his eyes flicked constantly toward the great house behind them. The lanterns still burned in the upper windows, and somewhere within those walls, Elias Wainwright slept or pretended to. Eveline didn't care which. She had waited too long, planned too carefully. Tonight, she would not stop until the river swallowed them both. Jonah didn't ask questions. He had learned silence as a form of survival, just as he had learned to hide the scar on his shoulder beneath his torn shirt. Eveline had told him only that they were leaving for a place where the air was free and no one called him property. It was a promise she didn't know how to keep, but one she would die to make true. At the edge of the plantation, near the old cypress grove, a small light flickered twice. It was the signal. A free black family from Savannah, the Carters, waited with a wagon, their faces tense with both courage and fear. They had guided runaways before, but never one bearing the blood of a man like Elias Wainwright. The journey began under moonlight, the wagon creaking softly as it followed narrow trails that ran parallel to the river. Every sound felt amplified: the hoot of an owl, the snapping of branches, the distant baying of dogs. Eveline sat with Jonah beneath a tarp, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since she was a child. Each mile between her and Merrowfield felt both freeing and heavy, as if the weight of the house clung to her like smoke. By dawn, Wainwright's wrath had already awoken the estate. The overseers gathered, rifles slung over their shoulders, hounds restless and hungry. Silas Crane led the pursuit, his face pale but determined. He had burned her letters once, but this time his silence had turned to obedience. The orders were clear: bring them back alive if possible. Kill them if not. Eveline and her companions pressed onward, cutting through marshland and thickets. The humidity clung to their skin, the river whispering beside them like an old ghost. Jonah never complained, though he stumbled often, his breath ragged. At one point, Eveline pulled him close, pressing a finger to his lips as the sound of dogs grew nearer. She could see the flicker of lanterns through the trees. The cruel rhythm of pursuit. The Carters led them into the reeds, wading waist-deep into the murky water. The smell of rot and life filled the air. They moved slowly, silently, the river their only refuge. Behind them, the barking grew louder, closer. Then came a gunshot, splitting the night in two. Eveline froze, the echo shaking her bones. A second shot followed, and the older Carter man collapsed into the reeds without a sound. His wife covered her mouth, eyes wide with terror, but she did not scream. She simply nodded for Eveline to keep going. When they finally reached the far bank, hours later, the moon hung pale and trembling above the water. Eveline collapsed, her dress soaked, her body shaking. Jonah knelt beside her, placing a small hand on her shoulder. His voice, barely a whisper, carried more strength than she had left. "We're not going back," he said. She looked toward the direction of Merrowfield, where the faint glow of lanterns still burned on the horizon. She knew her father was awake now, pacing, calculating, sending more men into the night. But for the first time in her life, Eveline did not feel afraid. She felt alive, raw and trembling, but alive. The river behind them hid the bodies of the dead and the sins of the living, and before them stretched a path she did not yet understand. Eveline took Jonah's hand again, gripping it tightly as the first light of morning touched the water. Whatever came next, freedom, death, or damnation, she would meet it on her own terms. Merrowfield was behind her, but its ghost would follow, and deep inside her heart, she swore it would never claim another soul again. The swamp swallowed them whole. The moment Eveline and Jonah stepped into it, the world behind them disappeared. The trees closing in like sentinels, the air thick with humidity and decay. The cypress trunks rose from the black water like ancient pillars, their roots twisted and knotted, their moss-draped branches hiding the sky. The city was miles away now, and Merrifield farther still, but the echoes of pursuit clung to them like ghosts that refused to die. For days they wandered through that watery maze, following no clear path, only the faint instinct that north meant freedom. The Carters had told Eveline about the swamps, how fugitives sometimes vanished into them and lived like phantoms, unseen and unclaimed. But the Carters were gone now, and Eveline was left with only her courage, Jonah's small hand, and the prayers she no longer believed in. By the third day, their food was gone. Eveline scavenged what she could, wild berries, bits of bark, and water that tasted of iron and earth. The mosquitoes were relentless, drawing blood until her arms were speckled with welts. Jonah grew pale, his steps slower, his breath shallow. When he began to shiver despite the heat, Eveline pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the burn of fever. Panic clawed at her throat. She built a shelter of branches and reeds on a small patch of dry ground and laid him down. The swamp hummed around them, alive with sounds she could not name: frogs, insects, the distant cry of some unseen creature. Eveline knelt beside the boy, whispering words she had not spoken since childhood. She asked for mercy, for strength, for forgiveness. She did not know who she was asking. That night, the fever worsened. Jonah murmured in his sleep, his voice slurred and weak. He spoke names Eveline didn't know, then one she did. Elias. He repeated it again and again, as if calling to the man who had cursed his life before it began. Eveline's stomach twisted. She wanted to wake him, to silence the word, but instead she listened. Every repetition a reminder that blood, even cursed blood, bound them both to the same monster. When morning came, the swamp was shrouded in mist so thick it felt like breathing through cotton. Eveline's reflection stared back at her in the still water, her face hollow, her eyes sunken, her skin streaked with dirt. She no longer looked like the daughter of a plantation master. She looked like the people her father had called property, and perhaps that was fitting. The swamp made no distinction between master and slave, sinner and saint. Here, all flesh decayed the same. By the fifth day, she began to hear things. Voices carried through the fog, whispers that sounded like her sister's, her mother's, even her father's. They called her name softly, coaxing her to return. Eveline clutched Jonah's hand and whispered back, "You can't have him." The swamp answered with silence, but she knew it was listening. When Jonah finally opened his eyes again, the fever had broken, but something in him had changed. His gaze was distant, older somehow. He sat up slowly, looking around at the endless trees. "It's watching us," he said. Eveline wanted to tell him it was just his imagination, but she could feel it too, the sensation of being observed by something vast and unseen. That night, as they huddled together, lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the dark silhouettes of the trees. Eveline thought of Merrifield, of the cellar and the graves that the storm had unearthed, and for the first time, she felt a strange clarity. Freedom was not salvation. It was survival. And survival, she realized, came with its own kind of sin. Jonah slept beside her, his breathing shallow but steady. Eveline stayed awake, staring into the murky darkness of the swamp, her mind teetering between hope and despair. The line between the two had blurred long ago, somewhere between the first lie she told her father and the first prayer she whispered in the dark. The swamp did not promise deliverance, it promised endurance. As dawn broke, the mist lifted, and Eveline rose to her feet, helping Jonah stand. They were thinner now, weaker, but alive. The path ahead was uncertain, the world beyond still cruel. Yet somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark that even her father's sins could not extinguish. The swamp had taken almost everything from her, her comfort, her innocence, her faith, but it had given her one thing in return: the will to keep moving, no matter what waited beyond the trees. The notice went up in Savannah 3 days after the storm cleared the coast. It was nailed to tavern doors, courthouse walls, and the pillars outside the church where Elias Wainwright once knelt in false humility. The paper was crisp and clean, written in the master's impeccable hand. "A reward," it read, "for the safe return of my daughter, Eveline Wainwright. Alive." Below that, in smaller letters, another line chilled the blood of those who read it. "For the child Jonah, dead or alive." The ink had barely dried before men began whispering in back rooms and sharpening their knives. Elias spared no expense. He sent riders along every road, hired bounty men from Charleston to Macon, and promised silver to anyone who brought proof of the fugitive's capture. But what terrified those who worked under him was not his money, it was his calm. The master spoke of his runaway daughter with no trace of grief, only precision. To him, Eveline was a stain that needed erasing, and Jonah, the living evidence of his corruption, was the knife twisting in that wound. Silas Crane was chosen to lead the manhunt. He did not ask why. He had seen what happened to men who questioned Elias Wainwright. Still, as he mounted his horse and studied the faces of the men beside him, hunters, trackers, and drunks lured by coin, something in his gut curdled. Eveline's letters still haunted him, the last one folded carefully in the pocket of his coat. It was the only truth he had ever dared preserve, and now he was being paid to destroy its author. They rode out at dawn, following the swollen edge of the Savannah River. The hounds barked furiously, their noses pressed to the mud, catching traces of sweat and blood carried by the storm. The air reeked of decay from flooded fields, and the constant buzz of insects masked the sound of fear that no one spoke aloud. By afternoon, they reached the cypress swamps, and Crane called a halt. The men cursed under their breath, uneasy at the thought of entering that drowned forest. "No one lasts long in there," one muttered. "It eats people." Crane knew he was right. The swamp didn't just swallow bodies, it swallowed truth. He stared into the mist where the trees rose like columns of smoke, and for a brief moment, he envied the girl. At least she was running toward something, while he was only circling the sins he'd spent his life serving. By nightfall, they pressed on, lanterns swinging, dogs howling. Somewhere ahead, Eveline and Jonah moved silently through the dark, their footsteps erased by water and mud. Crane felt the weight of every decision he had ever made. Each command he'd obeyed, every lie he'd told in the name of loyalty. He told himself that this time he would do what was right, that he would find them first, before the others did. But as the hours dragged on, he began to doubt that redemption was possible for men like him. When they stopped to rest, one of the younger hunters found a strip of torn fabric caught on a branch, white linen, damp and frayed. Crane held it to the light. It was part of a dress, delicate, the kind no enslaved woman would wear. Eveline. She was close. He pocketed the fabric before the others could see. As dawn approached, the swamp grew restless. The dogs barked wildly, refusing to move forward, whining as if they sensed something the men could not. The mist thickened until even the closest trees seemed to dissolve. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clearer, the echo of a woman's voice singing a lullaby, drifting through the air. It was Eveline's voice, or something that sounded like it. The men froze. Crane's heart pounded. He raised a hand for silence, listening. The song faded into the water, replaced by a stillness so heavy it pressed on their lungs. One of the hunters laughed nervously. "Ghosts," he said. Crane didn't answer. He knew what haunted this swamp wasn't ghosts, it was guilt. His and everyone else's. When morning came, the search continued, but Crane rode slower than before. He knew the truth of what he was chasing. The girl wanted freedom. The boy wanted life. And Elias Wainwright wanted neither, only control, even from afar. The bounty had turned blood into currency. And Crane's soul was already part of the payment. As the sun broke through the trees, he made a silent vow. If he found Eveline first, he would not bring her back. He would burn the notice himself, even if it meant his own ruin. The swamp could keep its secrets, the earth could keep its bones. But this time, at least one sin of Marrowfield would not return home. The night they brought Eveline back to Marrowfield, the air was heavy with heat and silence. Rain threatened the horizon, and thunder rumbled somewhere far beyond the river, as if the world itself protested what was about to happen. She was dragged through the gates by two men on horseback, her wrists bound, her dress torn and stained with swamp mud. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes hollow but burning with something unbroken. She did not cry. She did not beg. She had seen too much to waste her strength on fear. Jonah was gone. No one could say where. The swamp had swallowed him, and even the dogs refused to follow his trail. Some whispered he had drowned. Others claimed he had turned into mist and slipped away like a spirit. But Elias Wainwright believed neither. He knew the boy carried his blood, and his blood had a way of surviving. Still, his pride demanded performance, and he prepared it with the precision of a man staging a sermon. That same evening, the house blazed with light. Servants polished silver until their hands blistered. The long dining table was set with crystal, white linen, and dishes no one would eat. Invitations had gone out to every neighboring landowner. The master of Marrowfield was hosting a grand supper to celebrate the restoration of family order. The guests arrived curious, uneasy, whispering behind fans and brandy glasses about the scandalous daughter who had fled and returned in disgrace. Elias greeted them all with a smile. He wore a black coat and a red waistcoat, his posture as commanding as ever. No one could have guessed that only hours earlier he had struck his daughter hard enough to split her lip. Eveline sat at the far end of the table, her hands trembling beneath the cloth. The bruises on her arms were hidden by lace, but the defiance in her eyes could not be concealed. The meal unfolded under the glow of chandeliers, each crystal reflecting light like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Elias spoke of faith, loyalty, and legacy, his words sweetened with wine and rot. When he rose for a toast, the room fell silent. "To family," he said, lifting his glass. The word lingered in the air like venom. "Blood is our covenant, our burden, and our redemption. May it remain pure, even when tested by the disobedient." Eveline met his gaze, her lip bleeding anew from where she had bitten it to keep from screaming. Around them, the guests murmured polite approval, pretending not to see the madness flickering in their host's eyes. The orchestra in the corner played something soft and hollow, a melody that trembled like the house itself. As the servants moved through the room, one of them, a boy not much older than Jonah, stumbled, dropping a tray of crystal goblets. The sound shattered the spell. Wine splashed across the white tablecloth, dark and red like blood. Elias turned sharply, his voice cutting through the air. "Careless hands deserve correction," he hissed. But before he could rise, Eveline stood. Her chair scraped against the marble floor, echoing like a gunshot. "Enough," she said. Her voice was low, trembling but fierce. The guests froze. Elias's face hardened. "Sit down," he commanded. She didn't move. "You speak of blood," Eveline said, her voice growing stronger. "But every drop of it here is poisoned." The room went still. No one dared to breathe. Then Elias laughed, a slow, bitter laugh that chilled the air. "My dear child," he said, "you misunderstand. Poison is what keeps the unworthy from surviving." He raised his glass again, but before he could drink, lightning flashed outside, and the chandeliers flickered. The candles dimmed, throwing long shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, the light illuminated something at the window, a small handprint smeared in mud. Eveline's breath caught. "Jonah." The storm broke open above Marrowfield, rain hammering the roof, wind howling through the halls. Elias lifted his glass one last time, his voice steady despite the chaos. "To family," he repeated, but this time the word sounded like a curse. Eveline stood across from him, trembling but unyielding. And somewhere beyond the walls, the boy who bore the master's mark listened to the thunder and began his return. The storm raged long into the night, but inside Marrowfield, it was not thunder that made the house tremble. It was something far more human, far more damning. After the supper ended in uneasy silence, the guests departed under flickering lanterns, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They left behind a house thick with tension, a family rotting under the weight of its own name. Eveline sat alone in her room, her hands shaking as she tried to wash away the blood on her lip. Outside her window, the rain fell like a cleansing she could not feel. Downstairs, Elias Wainwright paced the length of his study. The candles had burned low, their light warping his reflection in the window. He muttered to himself, words tangled between prayer and madness. The toast still echoed in his ears. To family. The word that had once made him powerful now tasted like ash. He poured another glass of brandy and drank it fast, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. He thought of Eveline's eyes, defiant, unbroken. He thought of Jonah, the boy who bore his mark. His hand trembled around the glass, and for the first time in his life, Elias Wainwright felt afraid. Eveline could not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. She knew her father's silence was never mercy. It was preparation. When the lightning flared, she saw her reflection in the mirror, her face pale, her eyes sunken. She didn't look like his daughter anymore. She looked like her mother, a woman whose portrait still hung in the hall, eyes forever downcast, mouth forever silent. Something in her snapped. She rose from the bed and lit a candle, her steps quiet but certain. She walked toward the east wing. The cellar door was unlocked. That alone made her stop. Her father never left it unguarded. The air that drifted up was damp and heavy with the scent of oil and smoke. She descended the steps, the light from her candle trembling on the stone walls. At the bottom, she saw the remnants of everything he had built to hide his sins. Broken chains, empty cribs, the stains that no fire could ever erase. Her chest tightened with rage, with grief, with something she could no longer contain. She dropped the candle. The flame caught the oil immediately, climbing the walls like something alive. The fire spread fast, feeding on wood and cloth and memory. Eveline stumbled back, the heat slapping her skin, the smoke filling her lungs. Above her, she heard movement, her father's footsteps, sharp and furious. He called her name, his voice echoing through the house. Eveline. It was not the voice of a father but of a man whose empire was burning. The servants fled first, dragging the unconscious, guiding the terrified. The storm outside seemed to merge with the fire inside, thunder and crackling blending into one relentless roar. The grand staircase collapsed in a shower of sparks. Portraits melted into black streaks on the walls. Eveline ran through the halls, her nightgown aflame at the hem, calling for her sister, for Jonah, for anyone still alive. She reached the front door, turned once, and saw him. Elias stood at the top of the staircase, framed in light and fire. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief, as if he could not comprehend that his own blood had undone him. Their eyes met one last time. "You think this frees you?" he shouted. "You are me, Eveline. You are mine." Then the ceiling gave way. The great chandelier fell, crashing between them, its glass exploding into embers. Eveline turned and ran into the storm. By morning, Merrifield was gone. Only a skeleton of blackened beams remained, smoke curling into the dawn sky like the ghost of its former glory. The townspeople came to stare, whispering prayers and rumors. They found the bodies of servants, the remains of Charlotte still clinging to a scorched rosary. But of Elias Wainwright, there was nothing. Some said he burned, that the fire consumed him and his sins together. Others claimed they saw a figure riding north through the rain, his coat in tatters, his face half burned, clutching a small leather book. No one knew for certain. Eveline was found days later on the outskirts of Savannah, half conscious, her hands blistered, her hair singed. When asked what had happened, she said only one thing. The house confessed. The ruins of Merrifield smoldered for 3 days before the last ember died. When the wind blew through the ashes, it carried with it the faintest sound like a whisper. A child's voice, soft and distant, calling for his father. Then silence. The year was 1871 when the man arrived in Savannah. The city had changed, new storefronts lined the cobblestone streets, and the river no longer carried the same whispers it once did, but some things in the South never truly changed. Beneath the perfume of magnolia and cigar smoke, the past still clung to the air like a ghost that refused to be buried. He came on the morning train from Charleston, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low against the Sunday. The porter who carried his case swore later that he had never seen eyes like that man's, gray as smoke, cold as stone. At the courthouse, the clerks murmured when he gave his name. Jonah Wainwright. The syllables rolled through the room like thunder before a storm. The Wainwright name had not been spoken aloud in years, not since the fire that swallowed Merrowfield whole. The ruins had long been cleared, the land divided, the history politely forgotten. Yet here stood a man with a deed stamped and signed in the same elegant hand that once ruled the county. He laid it on the table without hesitation. "This land," he said calmly, "belongs to me." The magistrate studied him, his spectacles glinting in the morning light. Jonah's face was handsome in a way that unsettled people, not because of its beauty, but because of its familiarity. There was something in the sharpness of his jaw, the cool authority in his voice, that stirred unease. And when the coat slipped slightly from his shoulder, the clerk saw the scar. A crescent mark etched just below his collarbone, identical to the one the old records described on Elias Wainwright himself. Word spread quickly. By sundown, the city was buzzing. Some said he was a fraud, a northerner pretending to be of old blood. Others whispered that he was the master's bastard, come to collect the sins his father had left unpaid. Those who had lived through the burning of Merrowfield swore they saw the resemblance, not only in his face but in the way he carried himself. He moved like a man who had inherited not wealth, but vengeance. Jonah visited the ruins the next morning. The land was overgrown, wild and tangled, nature reclaiming what pride had destroyed. He stood where the great house once stood, his boots sinking into the soft earth. For a long time he said nothing. The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment it sounded like the faint cry of a child. He knelt, brushing his hand over the soil until his fingers touched something cold, an old key, blackened by fire. He pocketed it. As evening fell, he returned to Savannah and met with the lawyers handling the estate. He spoke little, listened less. When one of them nervously asked what he intended to do with the land, Jonah looked up with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through a man's soul. "I will rebuild it," he said, "but not as it was." They didn't understand what he meant. Perhaps he didn't either. But as he stepped out into the night, the gas lamps flickering along the riverfront, he felt the weight of two legacies pressing on his shoulders, the cruelty of the father and the pain of the mother. Both lived in him, their war waging silently behind his calm exterior. He was not purely one or the other. He was both the sin and the consequence. Later that night, a storm rolled in from the coast. Jonah stood by the water, the rain running down his face, watching the lightning illuminate the city that had once sold and sanctified lives. He spoke quietly, as if to the wind, "The blood that built this place will wash it clean." His reflection rippled across the black water, two faces overlapping, the ghost of Elias Wainwright and the son who had come to claim his debt. When the storm passed, Savannah slept. But those who looked toward the ruins of Merrowfield the next morning swore they saw smoke rising again, not from destruction this time, but from something being reborn. And in the courthouse, where his papers lay waiting, the name Jonah Wainwright shone under the morning sun, a name both cursed and sanctified, the child of two bloods, and the final heir to a legacy that refused to die. The workmen who uncovered the ledger in 1911 never knew what they had found. To them, it was only another remnant of the past, tucked behind the crumbling walls of an old courthouse being renovated to make way for progress. But when the dust cleared and the light hit the page, the words seemed to shimmer, as though the ink itself resisted time. The handwriting was deliberate, elegant, touched with the tremor of a man who had lived long enough to see ghosts wear flesh. The first pages were meticulous records, births, sales, transactions of property long gone. Then, halfway through, the language changed. The columns gave way to paragraphs, and the paragraphs to confession. The writer spoke not as a master or servant, but as a witness. For every secret buried, it read, there grows a root that will one day crack the marble of the proud. Beneath the final entry was a name, written with slow, deliberate care. Jonah Wainwright, son of the house, called Merrowfield. No one in Savannah remembered the name, not anymore. But the story it carried had lived on in whispers, in the way people avoided the road where Merrowfield once stood, in the way the air still grew thick there before a storm. The ledger gave those whispers a spine, a voice that spoke across generations. Jonah had written of the fire, of the sins that built the house, and of the blood that bound master and slave together in one terrible inheritance. He wrote of Eveline, the sister who freed him, the woman who burned the house that tried to own her soul. He wrote of a father who believed he could play God, and of how even God sometimes chooses silence to let men damn themselves. At the end of his life, Jonah returned to Savannah, no longer the boy who ran through swamps or the man who reclaimed his name. He was old now, his hair silver, his eyes still that impossible gray. He lived quietly above a small bookshop on Bay Street, where no one knew who he truly was. Some nights, he walked to the river and stared across the dark water, seeing not his reflection, but the face of a man he had spent his life outrunning. Elias Wainwright looked back at him from the ripples, a ghost carved into his blood. Jonah would whisper into the current, the sins of the father die when the son remembers. When he wrote the final page of the ledger, his hand trembled not from age, but from the weight of truth. He knew the book would one day be found. That was the point. It was his final sermon, his reckoning. He did not write to condemn, but to remind. The paper was his confession, his weapon, and his redemption. After the ledger was discovered, the historians who read it chose silence. They locked it away, claiming the ink was too damaged, the words too faint to decipher. But those who handled it spoke of something strange, how the air grew colder when they touched the pages, how the faint scent of smoke lingered even after the book was sealed. One of them claimed to have seen, for the briefest second, a gray-eyed man standing in the reflection of the courthouse window, watching. And so the legend of Merrowfield did not die. It lived beneath Savannah's charm, beneath the perfume of its gardens and the songs of its riverboats. The ledger became its pulse, beating softly beneath the marble and moss. The city moved on, as cities do, but every now and then, when thunder rolled in from the coast, someone swore they could hear it, the faint echo of a man's voice carried by the wind, whispering through the magnolias. For every secret buried, it said, there grows a root that will one day crack the marble of the proud. And then, silence. Only the sound of rain falling on old stone, washing away the dust, but never the memory.